Jesus said to his disciples, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." We've been hearing about the realities of war, the wars that have inflicted people around the world today still go on. We've been looking back to the times where wars have inflicted this country. And obviously the scars that they inflict are very real. They're physical, they're emotional, mental, and spiritual. And there'll be people in this congregation or for you watching online, and these things are very real whether or not you talk about them or not, because they have impacted you deeply. For others of generations that have come after such wars in this country, that is less known. I heard the stories from my grandparents and from my parents of doodlebugs coming over London, of people going down to air raid shelters and coming back up and finding their houses bombed. And we can but imagine through their situations. Or now, the generations now perhaps get to watch through films or interviews. And I wonder how many of you this week saw an interview that happened on breakfast television, I think it was, of a man, Harry Billinge. I don't know how many of you watched him. It went out on YouTube, and it's 8 minutes of worth watching, if I'm honest, because this man was a veteran of D-Day. He went onto the beaches there, and he talks about that. And it was fascinating in the interview, actually. These two people interviewing this man who'd gone through such horrors. And they said, what would you want the young people of today to take from what you have learnt? And he started to talk about the fact that through all that he'd learned, he went out when he was 16 or 18. He said, I was taught to kill. And he said, but what people need to know there is love in this world. And he said, people have turned away from God. He said how foolish they are. And I found it interesting because of his status and the respect they had for him. They could not stop this man actually talking and talking. And he gave a little sermon. In fact, it grew. He started to talk from Revelation. He talked about the time that Jesus would come back. And he really kind of was out there with this. And I thought, wow, what an opportunity. Nobody dared shut this man down. And it just was exciting to see. But what I'd like us to do today is to look at a couple of passages, short passages, which look at how did Jesus deal with conflict. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 9. If you want a Bible, the stewards will provide them for you, or please turn them on your phone if you have them there. Mark 9, starting at verse 33. And then I'll be looking briefly through the lens of James 4. So if you want to try to gather those together. But let me give you a little background of Mark 9. So Jesus has determined that he is going to travel with his disciples because he wants to actually do some teaching. He's going around Galilee. He does not want to be interrupted by doing other things. And he then is walking to Capernaum. We don't know exactly why, but that is what he is doing. And he, if he's in true Middle Eastern fashion, will be ahead of his disciples as he's on this journey. And they'll all be trundling along behind him. And it would seem possibly through the terrain there, it was quite narrow. And so there'd be a kind of a jostling for position behind Jesus, who was up the front. And we gather that they were having discussions or some sort of conflict between them. And so that's where we're going to pick it up in verse 33 of Mark chapter 9. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, What were you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. he took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." So what do we get from this? There's Jesus. He knows that his disciples have been arguing. And the thing is, he asks them a question that they don't wish to answer, because they know that what they've been arguing about is not what they should be worried about, because they are ashamed. And we might look at them and think, how could you, the disciples who've walked and seen all that Jesus do, how could they make this fundamental mistake that it mattered more to them about who was going to be the greatest? Just before this had happened, Jesus had told them that he was going to die. But don't worry, because he was going to come back. And its scriptures say that they were confused. So these were confused men on this journey. But then they want to work out who's going to be the most important. Possibly they're thinking, well, if Jesus is going now, who's going to follow on? Or who shall take the best position? These disciples, remember, had come from lowly origins. They were not the ones who had been picked to be disciples by other rabbis. They were fishermen. They were people who had nitty-gritty jobs, getting dirty. And now they've had this opportunity of walking with Jesus, being with him, and finding themselves probably a bit more center stage. And they rather like it. And that is a problem for them, as it can be so much a problem for us, that we like being center stage. It's a bit of a dangerous place for me to say this at the moment, isn't it? I'm standing on center stage. I remember one of my tutors at college just a few years ago saying to all of us as students, he said to us, "Beware," he said, "even though you may think of yourselves as quiet and unassuming," he said, "the fact is you will get to like having other people listen to you." That's a scary thought, because I stand before you as somebody who doesn't particularly like doing public speaking, but yet God has asked me to be a teacher. And so I do it, and I trust that God can speak through what I say. Let's look through the lens of James 4, verses 1 to 3. What causes fights and quarrels among you, it says? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. As we look through that lens, what was it that was going on in those disciples that meant that they really wanted this sense of being center? They wanted the affirmation. They wanted the privileged position that being with Jesus was having for them, and they didn't want to lose it. And there is all of that, I think, in all of us. How many of us do not like to feel that other people think highly of us? Now, of course, there are many things that it's right to be wanted to be respected for. We should surely want to be people of kindness, or people who are generous, or people who are gentle of spirit. These are things we want to be known for. But what they seemed to be arguing about was kind of a position. And there is a reality, as it says in James, that inside people, inside me, inside you, are these things that wage war. We have desires within us that we wish we often didn't have. But if we're real, we need to own up to the fact that we do have them. A week ago, I was on holiday, and I was talking to a friend, and he was talking about the fact that he's been reading in a book about a man called John Ruskin. I don't know if you've heard of him. I had heard his name, but I didn't know anything about him. He was an art critic. He was born in 1890, died in 1900. But he was a man who grew up at the influence of his mother's knee. He was a man who learned a load of scripture through just listening to his mum, and he could actually do it verbatim. And basically, he became a very strong activist in social issues as well as being an artist. And he used his influence in a good way. In his Bible, which is now in the British Museum, there is sort of side notes he has written in there. And he talks about the fact that within every human being, there is a broken soul, a torn aspect of people. And he describes it as the torn manuscript of the human soul. And I thought, well, as you know, I like my visual illustrations. So I've got here a manuscript. It's Latin. It's got this lovely illustration around it with calligraphy and drawings of flowers and an eagle at the bottom. I don't know if you can hone in on that. Anyway, it's just an illustration that within each of us, we were born to be a good manuscript made in the image of God. As we become believers, we become cleaned up when we have been made right with God. And yet still we are people who have war within us, that we end up wanting to do things our way. We want our rights to be higher than other people's rights. This week, I had one of those folks who knocked at my door, who was selling dusters and all sorts of other things. And I ended up in a conversation with this young man. And if you're on Facebook, you might have seen, because it's out there on Chalfont St. Peter Connected. And there was a lot of people saying a lot of negative things about these folks who are going around the houses. And anyway, I ended up talking to this one man on my doorstep and had a really interesting conversation with him. And I asked him a bit about his background and what was going on in his life and why he was doing the job he was doing. And as he talked to me, it became very evident there were a whole number of things in his background that meant his life was lived out of all these things that had happened to him. He talked about the fact that his father had been a really nasty man. And because I was preparing this sermon, I was thinking about this manuscript. And I thought, gosh, that's like a tear in his soul. And then he talked to me about the fact that at school he had dyslexia, he was bullied, and these whole things had really affected him. And again, I just thought that's another tear in his soul, his manuscript. And then he talked about the fact that he'd got into a wrong relationship and had a child out of wedlock, and he was torn because he couldn't see his daughter very often. And again, I just thought about these things. But this isn't just folks out there. I have things in my life. You would have things in your life that tear into your manuscript soul. What is it in you that has actually affected you through your life that mean you're not all that you wish you could be? I brought some sellotape here because I thought, well, let's try and fix those things, shall we? So let me fix the one about the young man. His life was hurt. I have to say that as I was talking to him, I was thinking, Jesus, how can I talk to him about you? How can I make that better? So how can I try to patch him up with the truth of sellotape? Except not the truth of sellotape, but Jesus. The thing is, though, even though I've now sellotaped it, it's not perfect. It's not back to the original one. Here's one I made earlier. Jesus wants us to know that he has good and perfect plans for us in the way that we live. He wants us to be people of peace and not to be people who war. He wants us to be people who recognize where we are torn so that we can bring all our tornness to God. I know that last week, for any of you who are here at this service, Dave Criddle talked about the things we bring that are torn. I deliberately didn't listen to his sermon till I completed mine, in case there was overlap. If there is overlap, it's because God brought it, not because I'm trying to copy Dave. But I was thinking about that illustration of the torn manuscript because I see in the disciples, they bring their tornness into their relationships with each other. And even though they had been followers of Jesus for that length of time, they still ended up with their own desires taking preference. So what does Jesus do? A lovely illustration. It talks about that, first of all, Jesus sat down with these 12. He gathered them around him. He said, come on, guys, I need you to know something. I need you to know something that is actually about transforming your understanding of who you are and what I have for you as your purposes. And then he goes, and presumably they're now in a house. It says they come to a house, and there'll be a household of people, and he gets a child, and he says, come here to some child. I wonder what it was like for that child. And he took that child into the midst, and the word that's used is that he took that child into the crook of his arm. I thought that was a lovely image. How many of us have ever had a child this close? So the child's face is right next to you. They feel the warmth of you. And Jesus was looking at him and then using him as an illustration to the disciples. And he was saying, this child, who you would know has no rights, no privileges in the society in which he was in, no NSPCC in those days, a child had no rights. And Jesus says to them, you need to become like a child. You need to let go of the privileges of status. You need to model yourself on what you have seen of the way that I live my life, says Jesus. And he used that child as an illustration to them. We today are also followers of the Prince of Peace. And instead of being people that want to climb some ladder for prestige, to get affirmation from other people, for me this image speaks of God saying, Jesus saying, come up close and personal to me. Let my breath be the breath on you. Feel the warmth of my embrace, and then you will not need the affirmation of other people. All of us will have had times when we have been in conflict, and we end up wanting things to be made right for ourselves. Perhaps we need to remember that we are torn, and our desires for our rights, for everything to be given for me, needs to be put into perspective of what Jesus' life was like. He was the one who walked with the women. That was not a way of it done in that society. He touched lepers. He reached out to tax collectors who were hated. He did not live life as everybody else did. And he's saying to his disciples, you need to let go of those privileges. You need to see the tornness in other people so that you have deep compassion for them, as he has compassion for us, and he did for those disciples. Even though we might think they should have learnt it all before, here he is taking time with them to say, come up close and personal, see things from my perspective. We're going to now have a worship song sung over us. And just sit and listen to the words that are sung, because they are a part of understanding the perspective God would have for us of others, so that we can truly be people of peace and not be people of conflict and war. We are called to be those who live like Jesus did.